Hi, welcome, Jasmine. How are you?
I'm well.
So today we are focusing our webinar on the intersection of racism and human trafficking. And just for those who may be new to our webinars and not familiar with our organization, we are a survivor-informed organization that works to end this atrocity by providing educational resources, giving presentations, giving awareness, and engaging in advocacy across the nation. So we also support survivors of human trafficking in healing and thriving through a financial support of our member houses and providing educational scholarships. I'd like to take this opportunity to commemorate the Feast of St. Josephine Bakhita. She was the patron saint of human trafficking victims, and her feast day was on February 8th on Sunday. And for those who are not familiar with who she is, St. Josephine Bakhita was born in southern Sudan in 1869. As a young girl, she was kidnapped and sold into slavery. She was treated brutally by her captors as she was sold and resold. She did not remember her name, so Bakhita, which means fortunate one, was given to her by her kidnappers. So please join me in a brief prayer for all human trafficking victims and survivors, as well as the children in Sudan who are right now experiencing a humanitarian crisis, and are at risk themselves of potentially being trafficked. So please join me with this moment of prayer and silence as we pray. God of hope and peace, touch our hearts and energize our ongoing efforts in abolishing this heinous crime against humanity, so that every victim is freed and every survivor's life renewed. You bless St. Josephine Bakhita of Sudan with compassion for others. May her prayers comfort and strengthen the women and men and children who are in search of freedom. We ask for transformation of heart for those who inflict pain, anguish, and grief on our vulnerable brothers and sisters. Give us generosity to stand in solidarity with others so that together we heal the hearts and lives of all your people. Grant this through our Lord Jesus Christ, your Son, who lives and reigns with you and the Holy Spirit, one God, forever and ever. Amen. So please note that our webinars, while they're free, donations are always appreciated. You can donate and find more information about our organization and this issue at alliance-to-end-human-trafficking.org. Please note that this webinar is being recorded and that you can find a whole list of our webinars on different topics surrounding human trafficking on our YouTube channel. And this webinar also will be shared with you as well as anyone who are registered so that you can further share this important information. So please join me now in welcoming our guests. First, we have Tori Curbelo, who is the Lifeway Network's Director of Education and Training. Tori is responsible for advancing the organization's education and training initiatives, including strategic program development, community trainings, and cross-sector partnerships. With over a decade of experience in human rights and program development, Tori has designed and facilitated trainings for more than 30,000 individuals across sectors, including government, social services, the health sector, and the private sector. She co-authored UNICEF's second strategic framework on child online protection, published research in the Journal of Modern Slavery, and convened multi-stakeholder initiatives to embed responsible recruitment and worker protections in supply chains. Next, we have Jasmine Conway, who is a human trafficking survivor, systems consultant, and founder of One Survivor to Another. With lived experience of commercial sexual exploitation and a master's in NGO management from Johns Hopkins University, she bridges frontline insight with multi-sector strategy. Jasmine was the lead researcher on the Washington State-sponsored study, Impacts of the Commercial Sex Industry on Black and African American Communities in Washington. She advises community and public agencies on socially attuned, survivor-led CSE prevention initiatives and innovative service pathways that center lasting and measurable impact. And so, with that, I will hand it over to our speakers. We will be taking questions after their talk. I will be leading them in some Q&A myself, and then we'll open it up to our general audience for their own questions, which you can put in the chat. You will not be able to do a live Q&A. And I'm sorry, the chat is disabled. You have to put it in the Q&A. So with that, I'll hand it over to Tori.
Thank you so much. Let me share my screen real quick. Just have a few slides. Okay. Great. So just for those of you who are less familiar with Lifeway, it's the only organization in the Metro NYC area to offer long-term safe housing for women survivors of human trafficking in all its forms, including sex labor and organ trafficking. And we recognize that even after a compelling trafficking situation, the work has really just started for the women that we serve, whether the situation of human trafficking was a few years ago or more recent, life doesn't automatically become better. And I think that's an important point. As Christine shared a little bit about my work, which I want to share just two anecdotes real quick. My responsibility is providing education to the public at large, as well as internally at Lifeway Network. And that includes integrating racial bias training into sessions and communications. And quite candidly, I've had some challenging experiences. Sometimes we think that implicit bias is difficult to combat, and that's certainly true. But in my experience, sometimes that bias has been more overt than I would have thought. So like, for instance, one day we had sent out a routine newsletter to spread awareness for Black History Month, and our executive director, who identified then as a person of color, she wanted to note that we were at that time a person of color led organization, noting that the leadership team comprised of myself, who's a Latina, and many of my other colleagues. Within a few hours of sending out that email, we actually got a response back that I actually printed out and have saved because it, I think, came as a surprise just because it was a very routine communication that we had sent out. But the person said, "You have completely lost my support with this email. Women of color-led organization, who built this org for which you now take credit? This affirms my decision to stop donating." And then I had another experience reviewing routine evaluations, as I always do for internal workshops, external workshops. And one of the individuals left their name on it and left an answer that I was kind of surprised, just because it's a textbook response of what you should not probably say. And of course, I'm open to all kind of critical feedback, but that person had said that essentially that the information wasn't useful to them because they're already very aware and they have friends from all cultural backgrounds, something to that effect. So there was still a lot of work to be done, but with that, pushing onward, just wanted to share a few things to further provide insights to this conversation. I think that it's assumed that history can be easy to forget, and I think it is easy to forget history, but the impacts nonetheless might be invisible, but are still very difficult to erase. So one of my favorite illustrations of this is presented in this book by Kevin Bales. He documents how exploitation evolved after slavery was outlawed. The practice of convict leasing became commonplace. This is where African Americans were targeted for petty crimes such as cursing in public or hitching a ride on a freight train. When they were brought in front of a judge and couldn't pay court fines because they had recently left slavery and didn't have an accumulation of wealth or any kind of savings, local businessmen would then come in and pay the debt in exchange for free labor. Large corporations created massive markets for this labor, signaling to local sheriffs that they would buy as many prisoners as could be arrested. And because these men were rebranded as convicts rather than slaves, the crime remained hidden. Fast forwarding to today, in 2026, you might already know this, but it's important to note that slavery was never fully abolished, as the 13th Amendment has a loophole called the Punishment Clause, which states that slavery is abolished except as a punishment for a crime. So a common fallacy is that only an individual can be a trafficker, but there is something called state-imposed trafficking, and that's where a state or militia group is a trafficker. So out of the 50 million who are estimated to be trafficked globally, it's estimated that about 4 million of those are trafficked through state-imposed trafficking. And today in the United States, there's about 7 states where incarcerated workers are virtually paid nothing for their work. And this is problematic because it creates an incentive to criminalize. And remember that some populations are overrepresented within the criminal justice system. I think in today's climate, we'd be amiss to not talk about labor migration. So in 2021, for instance, in a Polaris analysis, they estimated that about 54% of risk factors were attributed to migration or relocation. Labor trafficking is pervasive in agriculture and construction and domestic servitude, industries that have historically been structured around racialized and disposable labor. Workers on H-2A and H-2B visas face structural power imbalances. So Polaris project analysis, a different one than I quoted before, but they found a median of $4,000 in illegal recruitment fees, which means that the worker was expected to pay that before even having started a job, before even having an income to be able to pay that amount. Exploiters target vulnerabilities tied to immigration, including language barriers, job dependency, isolation, and fear of deportation. And migration itself isn't the risk, but the racism embedded in immigration and labor systems is what creates vulnerabilities. And above all, there is certainly a double standard for those who are taking on more dangerous jobs. And we could look no further than the recent exposés that's happened over the course of the last few years on child labor. So you might have noticed many of these, especially around the year 2024. But naturally, what you may have noted is that most of the cases involved immigrant children. And these weren't just cases of children helping out their families on chores here and there. It re-exposed that these children are involved in some of the most hazardous and dangerous work. Some were reported to have died from, for instance, plummeting to their death from rooftops. Some have gotten addicted to tobacco from working on tobacco farms. These are just some of the examples, right? And as a response to that, some states have actually moved to weaken child protection laws. 6 states did that. And it really begs the question that if these children were white, would that have been the reaction from states? I'm not quite sure or really convinced of that, but I'll leave that here and pass it on.
Thank you so much. And then we'll go ahead and hand it over to Jasmine.
Thank you. My name is Jasmine Conway, and I am a survivor of sex trafficking and commercial sexual exploitation more broadly. But fast forward, uh, post exploitation, I went to school half a dozen times, I feel like. I'm on my second master's degree now, and I advise systems and community. Um, or more expressly, I advise a lot of cross-sector engagement. So I wanted to talk specifically today about kind of the intersection of my work, being system strategy combined with survivor-informed research, and to talk to you all about how inequality really shapes vulnerability for Black women and girls, and how recognition and response has continued to evolve um, in regards to recognizing our vulnerability. So I want to start by grounding us in some commonly used terms, and I'll define these terms so we strengthen our shared contextual understanding. So when people speak about these terms, we have a tendency, especially in professional jargon, to use them interchangeably, but they actually take on their own independent meanings. Sex work really is in reference to consensual paid sexual exchange between adults. Um, and this presupposes that other alternatives exist and that there is no coercion or nothing that necessitates engaging in sex work. However,
Jasmine, I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, but your screen is side by side with your camera and your slides, and the slides are showing really small. Is there a way?
oh, sure, I can move it around. One moment.
Yeah, that would be great. Thank you. Much better. Thank you so much. Sorry to interrupt.
No, you're welcome. Um, so sex trafficking is a legal term, and that involves force, fraud, or coercion, or it's any commercial sex act involving a minor. Force implies physical violence or the threat of physical violence, fraud, um, meaning deception about circumstances, and then coercion is extensive manipulation, psychological and often physical manipulation and like vulnerabilities. And then whereas commercial sexual exploitation, CSE, that lives kind of in the middle, I would say, of sex trafficking and sex work because it's exchanges of sex for money, housing, food, safety, or really anything that is of value to the party that is exchanging the sex, but where their freedom of choice is really undermined by their survival needs, past trauma, or coercive control, and wherein they see um, very limited opportunity or they don't see that other alternatives exist. So many times I will use the phrase CSE or commercial sexual exploitation, and that encompasses sex trafficking as well, but it's a broader term which acknowledges that while not everybody's particular situation meets the legal definition of sex trafficking, there still is a lot of survivors who don't see any other alternatives or don't have other alternatives to engaging in uh, sex work. So the commercial sex industry is a global industry, and there's a lot of money to be made from it. So the International Labor Organization estimates that of the 27.6 million people worldwide that are trapped in forced labor, about 6.3 million of those people are being sexually exploited. The best way that I can summarize it to help people understand how exploitation happens is that you need to examine the conditions of the communities and the circumstances that people come from before even you start to analyze their choices. Because again, um, in regards to commercial sexual exploitation, most often survivors that I have spoken with did not see alternatives to engaging in the sex trade. When needs go unaddressed rather, people become profit. So, we're going to get into some of the like intersectional and root causes of commercial sexual exploitation. So that's one of the themes that I would encourage you all to take away from what I'm telling you today. And I think that you'll see it more vividly on the slides that are forthcoming. So I'll give you guys just a brief history of um, the realities of exploitation for Black women and girls. And um, I'm not sure how many of you all are familiar, but commercial sexual exploitation really has its roots in um, chattel slavery. And so during the enslavement era, sexual violence against Black women did not um, register as a crime. It was not a crime. Black women were characterized as a possession. Um, Black women's bodies were commodified, and there was no consent for us. So essentially, we didn't get a say. There were racialized stereotypes that Black women, were Jezebels and basically uh, made to be commodified and used in any way that a slave owner would want them to be. So post emancipation period, we saw that yes, slavery for all intents and purposes had been um, illegalized. However, new laws regulated employment, movement, and public behavior for Black people broadly. And so social and legal systems really continue to interpret the sexual exploitation of Black women and girls really as deviance rather than recognizing their victimization or that there was coercion involved in their circumstances or that they had constrained circumstances. None of those things were um, seen as factors. Um, their behavior was interpreted just as deviant or delinquent. And then, so fast forward into the 20th century, uh, we see that economic exclusion still remains pervasive. So examples of that were like redlining, restricted housing access, like under-resourced schools, limited access to jobs, limited access to even loans for business capital and things like that. And so that kind of structural limitation concentrated poverty and instability in a lot of the Black communities. And these conditions, combined with racialized stereotypes, really influenced how vulnerability was perceived and responded to. So, Black women historically have been commodified, and then in the 20th century, you see that Black girls were more likely to be adultified and less likely to be recognized as victims of exploitation. So now we're into modern commercial sexual exploitation, which is current commercial sexual exploitation, where coercion really persists through instability, through those conditions, kind of those structural limitations for Black communities, and then grooming and poverty and economic vulnerability. So, we see that misidentification and under-identification continue also to persist. And then misidentification, or rather identification period, is important because it ultimately impacts whether individuals get connected to supportive pathways, so that they can promote their wellness, and if they are ready to be able to exit um, the sex trade, they can. But both misidentification and under identification really influence those pathways, whether people are recognized and discovered to be victimized, or whether people are unintentionally labeled as other than a victim, which puts them on a different pathway. Oftentimes, that pathway is more punitive. And if they're not identified, they're just overlooked entirely, and then they get no help. So that's kind of where we're sitting right now in this under identification and misidentification of Black women and girls as it pertains to being commercially sexually exploited. So this big yellow bubble at the bottom, emerging recognition and response, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge that a lot of the cross-sector engagement that I do and a lot of the multidisciplinary stakeholders that I interact with uh, really care about survivors. I often use that term interchangeably as well, with parties who've been commercially sexually exploited. So they really care about survivors, and they are trying to collaborate with each other to strengthen protection and support for survivors. Um, However, many of the multidisciplinary and cross-sector collaborations are like severely underfunded, in my opinion. And so I think there could be promising development that comes from multidisciplinary stakeholders being at the same tables with each other, building out anti-trafficking response. Um, but those kinds of teams have to be well resourced. Um, but suffice it to say that trauma-informed practices, diversion efforts, culturally attuned and peer-led services are slowly improving identification and engagement of survivors, just that these are under-resourced kinds of collaborations. I won't go into great detail for sake of time with this next slide, but I just wanted to talk a little bit about the root causes that contribute to the commercial sexual exploitation of Black women and girls, specifically talking about the hypersexualization of Black women and girls, which I referred to on a previous slide. Poverty and economic instability, that's one of the key drivers for Black women and girls. Um, and then I would say homelessness and housing instability, that is absolutely like a foundational driver for Black women and girls, because the reality is even when a Black youth may be struggling at home and they leave home and they then go out into the streets, there there's a lot of couch surfing that can occur. There's a lot of shelter hopping that happens with young girls, specifically who are under the age of 16, um, because, there's attempts to force family reunification, and then just homelessness more broadly affecting adult Black women. and instability, like having to figure out how to pay the rent, having to figure out how to keep a roof, some form of shelter over their heads is a huge driver for Black women and girls. And then the last one I'll highlight on this slide is intergenerational rather distrust of institutions. And I don't think a lot of people really think about this as being something that could be a root cause that contributes to Black women and girls' commercial sexual exploitation. But when the harm or the trauma or the reputation of institutions precedes them, and there's this interracial just distrust that's really pervasive, which there is in our community, and it's based on historic realities, right? Interacting with institutions, um, then Black women and girls feel disenfranchised from accessing supportive services through these institutions. Many Black women and girls cite being harmed punitively by these systems, being discriminated against by the systems, or, like going to the systems and asking for help and being turned away. So, the pathways into commercial sexual exploitation, just to recap, are really lack of safe shelter, food, or resources, sometimes early exposure and desensitization. So, when you come from communities that are impoverished, you know, you you may be exposed earlier to people engaging in commercial sexual exploitation or commercial sex acts to make money. And I don't want to use the term normalizing because I feel like that puts the onus on the individuals, whereas the onus is really on the conditions around them. So I'll say like desensitized to those conditions, right? And if that's what you see around you, and that's what you hear in music, and those are the conditions that are around you, and that's the path that like forward to escape impoverishment and things like that, and you don't see other alternatives, then that's what you're likely to do. And then also, recruitment often happens by peers, partners, or trusted people, and not necessarily by strangers, that like a lot of people think that that's a big misnomer. Oftentimes people think that like trafficking happens based on strangers coming into your world. A lot of times, especially for Black women and girls, it happens first by someone that they are in love with, someone close to them. Um, and that person uses emotional manipulation to groom them, and they feign care for them. They build their hope up. They make them feel like they are loved and that they can belong. And all of that is to ultimately exploit them. Okay, so I'll go ahead and move on to the what can community do slide again for sake of time because I know I'm taking up so much time. So some community stakeholders, as you guys many of you are, play a critical role in prevention and protection for all survivors, um, but especially for Black women and girls. And the reason why I say that is because community presence and awareness can increase visibility for us, right? And I think Tori kind of mentioned this. It can help to counter stigma, right? So what can community do? Community can support culturally responsive organizations. A community can help increase awareness of grooming and vulnerability factors, and also to help to combat those stigmas and stereotypes about people based on racialized perceptions. Um, Community can help invest in housing stability, support programs and for prevention programs for youth and caregivers, um, and advocate for trauma-informed and culturally responsive practices to be included across sectors. Thank you.
Thank you so much, both of you, for all your insights, for covering, there's multiple concepts when it comes to what is racial discrimination in our society, and it can be through migrants and farm workers and children and child laborers from other countries to the African American population. So there's really a broad spectrum, and I really appreciate you guys shedding a light on that. Um, and I think we see some of this racial discrimination even in the media when it comes to any crime. I feel like when we see there's a white, blonde hair, blue-eyed woman that goes missing. Seems like it gets a lot more media attention than when an African American woman might go missing, right? And we've seen that with different cases around the country and even follow-up programs on Netflix, right? So I want to talk about that for a second and how how are stories, would you say, are amplified, or how are survivors of color treated differently when it comes to not only the media, but some of our service systems, whether it's healthcare, in the shelters, or the courts, or even law enforcement?
Sure. I think that's kind of a loaded question, a lot of questions in one, so I'll respond to some aspects of it. But I think generally for media, what gets attention is very dramatic, very like bold headlines, bold stories, and doesn't really leave a lot of room for complex nuance, which is what these conversations of racial bias really entail, is there's a lot of deep analysis, a lot of data, a lot of great stories, but they might not be deemed newsworthy. And I've been on the end of trying to advocate for certain stories to be pitched or sharing certain things, and journalists kind of pushing back and being like, yeah, we get it, but like, do you have something else? And so I think, unfortunately, that it gets left out of the conversation and media depictions. And I think one of the earlier exercises I used to do in trainings was have folks do like a Google search of human trafficking and what do they actually see, because you can't detect something that you don't fully understand. And a lot of what you understand is what you're consuming, your media and all of that. And oftentimes they point out in the Google image search, and this might have changed because it's been like a lot of years and I haven't done the exercise in a while, is who gets depicted as a victim and who gets depicted as a perpetrator. And certainly they picked up on, like, sometimes you'll see hands over mouth as like a trafficker, and tends to be of a darker complexion, or ambiguous depiction, stuff of that nature. So I think that absolutely plays a role into, I think, perceptions and stuff.
Yeah, for sure. Jasmine?
I would just add to that, that Black women and girls are often not believed. Our circumstances, I think, um, are not validated, and many of the Black women and girls that I've talked to find it difficult to even access services, like, first of all, there's a great deal of trauma that comes up to have to resurface your victimization. And many times Black women and girls get viewed through this lens, which requires really arduous questioning, really, um, you know, kind of a lot of insensitivity. And um, many times we go and we pour our heart out and tell people our circumstances only to be turned away. Um, and it is disheartening at the very least. And it also serves to teach us that trusting social systems is consequential for us, right? Because ultimately we go and we pour our hearts out, and now we have to worry about what people will do with our history, with our transparency, and we still get met with little recourse in the end. And certainly I could talk forever about the necessity for culturally responsive media and things of that nature. But I think Tori did a great job of handling that. And so I will leave it here.
Thank you, Jasmine. And I just want to take this opportunity. If you have a question that you would like to ask our panelists, please put that in the Q&A now, and we'll get to those in just a moment. So one of the things I wanted to also highlight when we talk about slavery of the past, right? It looks very different. Sometimes human trafficking is referred to as modern day slavery. And while it did target a very specific race, and now trafficking targets any, race, color, ethnic background, socioeconomic background, we still see some of the similarities. So we still see women of color as the majority of the people who are being bought and sold, and that we still see that the majority of the buyers are actually white, either wealthy or, middle, it's not necessarily the sleazy looking guy. It's doctors, it's lawyers, it's people of our that are, deemed as reputable in our society that are buying these women of color. And how many times do we see that the buyer gets let go and the victim is arrested for prostitution, right? And so, and I'm wondering how much of that racial discrimination comes into the role of sometimes law enforcement, which are becoming more educated now with human trafficking and so forth. But would either of you like to comment on the law enforcement side of it and the demand side?
Sure. Yeah, I think that professionals in general, there's certain professions that come in more contact with potential survivors of trafficking, and I think that's law enforcement. I think healthcare, certain shelters, they're more likely to interact with these folks. And I don't think that they necessarily, so from my experience educating law enforcement, their approach is really criminalization. That's their like specialty, right? And that's not always the lens that one should take. And when asked the question, for instance, like, what would you do if you interact with someone that actually needs support? What might you offer them? I'm often met with kind of just a blank stare or not really knowing where to refer them to. Like the referral to a community organization is not there. Um, and so I think generally that's a problem, even if you erase the racial element, but then you add like a racial lens to it, and it definitely complicates the picture. And as you were saying, kind of flips the dynamic of someone that might need support might actually just only be seen as a victim. Or the other flip side is they might just be dismissed, and that's just told from all kinds of different populations that over and over again, they're either not taken seriously or they're just arrested. It's like one of those two options, kind of like a binary, but the support aspect isn't really there.
Thank you. Jasmine, do you have
I
anything
would
to add?
add to that historically, I would say that Tori is correct that historically law enforcement has focused more extensively on enforcement, right? Um, and I do think that today that looks a little different in some places and in some contexts, um, because there are some law enforcement that are engaging in trauma-informed trainings and actually training their entire departments and things like that around um, basically being able to engage with people that they suspect may be victims of human trafficking. So that I think is a step in a right direction and seems promising. I would encourage, though, that not just law enforcement, but like Tori said, all like first responders, right? Engage in more trauma informed training or trauma responsive actually training, um, and culturally attuned trainings as well, because we see circumstances that people run into where they just simply don't understand each other, or they don't understand how a person may speak, how a person may present, and things like that. So I think really that yes, there have been small glimmers of these trauma responsive practices being implemented. But what I would love to see as a survivor is for these kinds of trainings to really flourish among first responders in general.
Yeah, I think
Yeah,
that,
and I think, I'm
oh,
sorry,
sorry.
go ahead.
I think there is good evidence that when training is done, it's done well. And they've captured some of that for law enforcement and some other professions as well. And so I think it's promising when it's done and can be taken seriously. But yeah, it's all depends on when it's prioritized and who it's like sometimes you go in for training and they only have 10 minutes and that's not a lot of time to really unpack such a complex issue. So I think it is good to give credit where credit's due that we have come a certain amount of way. And I think that gives us a little bit of hope to continue on.
Yeah, and I think those are great points. Training is so important, and education and awareness, and teaching not only law enforcement but healthcare providers and so forth what is trauma-informed care. And it reminds me of a story I'll just share real quick. Um, when we talk about prevention, right, and not only just coming out of a trafficking situation, but my friend was telling me that she was working in her yard, and these two little African American girls, they're probably, I don't even know, around 10 years old. They had been missing for a couple days. And they kind of approached her, and she ended up calling law enforcement. She realized, they had been missing, they were runaways, and so forth. And so law enforcement showed up, and this guy is just basically interrogating these little girls. And she interrupted the interview. And she said, "Excuse me, can you come over here for a second?" And she was like, "Do you have a daughter?" And he's like, "Well, yeah." And he's like, "I want you to talk to these girls like you would talk to your daughter, right?" And he's like, "Oh." Like it was like he didn't even realize how he was coming across or how he was talking to these little girls. And if they had been a victim of a crime, right? Or if, do you think they're going to disclose to him? In this manner that he was speaking to them, we have to show compassion. We have to show that, they're not they're not the necessarily in trouble here. Like they need services, they need help. Like why did they run away? And so forth. So I just want to bring that as an attention, because I think sometimes runaways are so vulnerable to trafficking. And are we thank God my friend was able to intervene before they became a potential victim of trafficking, because we know the traffickers are out there targeting little girls like that. And how is law enforcement responding to these situations as well? So I will go ahead, take a look at what questions we have here in the Q&A before moving on. So we have one by from Jack. Well, I believe all minority groups have been affected by the issues both speakers have pointed out can either especially to the challenges with Native Americans. He was on a call this morning and there were detailed breakdowns in various groups, but nothing on Native Americans, which is another very vulnerable population. Can either of you speak to that?
Yeah.
I will say just something very briefly. I absolutely recognize that Indigenous individuals are absolutely disproportionately impacted by commercial sexual exploitation as well. Um, I have many Indigenous allies. I don't strive to tell their story. I strive to be an ally to my Indigenous counterparts. My experience as a Black survivor, I think makes it innate that I'm able to speak most robustly to the experience of Black women and girls that have survived commercial sexual exploitation. And I absolutely will speak more broadly in some instances, but I tend to like to leave room for others to be able to come into fellowship with stakeholders to share about their own experiences because our experiences are nuanced according to our unique cultures and things like that. And I don't feel that I know enough about their unique circumstances to do justice to wanting to explain it to you all. So I feel like that's best done by um, someone Indigenous.
Yeah, and Tori?
Yeah, I echo Jasmine's thoughts too. I'm very cautious about talking about um, other experiences that are not mine. I can share briefly, but I think, like Jasmine said, I probably won't be able to do really any of the. I think this topic in general, it's very complex for an hour, but um, I can just share that while I was putting together the slides, there's just so many notable parallels, really. I think like quickly in like 2 minutes, I try to walk through like, from slavery to today, what's happened. And I think you see common threads in Indigenous narratives too, that in during the colonization period, there's a lot of recording of I'm sorry, journal entries from colonizers at that time. And many Indigenous folks have reported and have explained that they reject this notion this notion that they were already engaged in sexual exploitation, because if you read some of the journals, they document in great detail just the horrendous acts that they were committing on the Indigenous folks at that time. And they were like, that was actually brought to us, that was done to us. And then now you're saying that that kind of always existed. And then you fast forward to today, and some statistics that you see is just an overrepresented representation of Indigenous folks in sex trafficking. So, like for instance, this is a fact that we had posted in Lifeway quite a bit ago, so it might be a little bit outdated, but it kind of shows you the disparity that in South Dakota, where Native American women represent 40% of sex trafficking victims, um, they're only 8% of the population, though. So that's huge, like 40% versus 8%. And it may have changed since then. Data is constantly being outdated, but I think it pretty much gives you a good picture of that. And I know one added complexity that Indigenous folks face is that they have already the criminal justice system is really difficult to navigate. I'm getting justice in general, but that added layer of having a federal government and then their own tribal systems, it further creates a barrier for being able to get justice at times. So that's another layer to consider. But um, yeah,
Yeah.
probably lots more to get into on that front.
Yeah, and we actually discussed doing a whole webinar on this particular topic. So definitely stay tuned to our future webinars, and this might be something that we address more in depth later on this year. So I also have a comment here from Melissa Bennett who said, "This is really good. I wish I could share my thoughts as a Black woman that's also a survivor." Thank you so much, Melissa, for being here with us today. We wish you could share too. Unfortunately, this is not a live where we're taking live comments, but I just want to do a shout out. We appreciate your being here and for everything that you do. And then we
Yeah,
have
thank you, Melissa.
um, so I have another anonymous comment. I'm connected with an agency helping street women. They say it takes a long time to convince a woman to exit the work, partially because of drug dependency. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, so sometimes because of drug dependency, it can take a long time to help women exit the work. However, I would say even if there is no chemical dependency, a lot of times it takes survivors a great deal of time to um really like successfully exit. There's sort of a recidivism factor where um a survivor will uh like quasi exit, if you will. So they're exiting, but they're facing all of these arduous circumstances because realizing that exit is impacted by, hey, can I exit and can I get a job? Well, they may have a gap in their employment history. Can I exit and can I get a job because I have a high school diploma at least? Sometimes that is not the case. There are many extenuating factors that can continue to pull a survivor back into the life, including having a criminal record as a barrier to being able to go on to get housing and sustainable employment. And then also too, we're human beings and we love our community, whether that's the people that we are dealing with in the sex trade or the people that are in community with us out of the sex trade, right? So like relationships are not neatly severed like that, like a lot of times it's relational too. People grieve the absence of their trafficker. They may grieve the absence of other people that they are trafficked alongside. And then there's that constant pull, so um people may kind of get recruited back in by the trafficker, a new trafficker, other people that they were formerly in the life with. Um, so there's a lot of ebb and flow to it. And the best advice that I can give is just really lean in the times where they are asking for support and be a consistent support, irrespective of whether they are engaging in sex work or not. Like your position doesn't change. You are a helper. You're there to help them. Um, and, they may go back in and out several times. That is very normal when working with survivors. It's very normal. It's very little alarming if you routinely work with survivors, but just the consistency and the compassion and being available to them when they do want to seek help and letting them know that you're not seeking help in error. You're seeking help from somebody who actually will help you is, I think, the best thing that you can do.
Yeah, thank you so much. Tori, did you want to add anything? So, I know there was, if you guys could just take a moment, please, and put your contact information in the Q&A. I saw there was a couple comments asking if you might be willing to speak or, help provide any types of services. But I just want to take a moment. I know we're right at the hour. I don't know if you guys have a few more moments. If you have to drop off, I understand, but there were a couple questions, comments that I really wanted to get to. One person commented that they would love to speak about the male inequality and exploitation side of it. And you all are in luck because our next webinar next month will be on gender inequality and human trafficking. So we'll be hearing from both the male and female perspectives on that. So please join us. Next month, we have it slated for March 26th at the same time. And we'll be sending out some more details on that. In addition, um, there was a question or a comment about speaking at a ladies shelter. So I will defer that for you guys to connect together on that specifically. One person did comment, how would you suggest me bringing up this topic in my survivor leader spaces? I notice a lot of people don't feel comfortable addressing injustice. So I think sometimes we do get uncomfortable when we're talking about racial injustice and so forth. Do you have just a I don't know if you can answer that quickly, but a quick answer on some of the best ways or resources that you can share with us? I'm happy to share with our with the follow-up email as well.
Sometimes what is helpful is anonymizing surveys and, like asking just brief exploratory questions with survivor leaders and, making sure that they know that their responses are anonymized. Sometimes I've seen that facilitators are really, really helpful in this regard because sometimes people are just really afraid of like shaking the boat and they don't want to express themselves and be very real and then have it come as with ramifications for them later on. So sometimes having someone that is a neutral third party facilitator, someone that's their role to facilitate like equity and inclusion and things like that um in the mix really helps because it's their role to surface those kinds of disconnects and someone that none of the parties really know because they have that neutrality there. I've seen that be effective in some spaces.
I love that. The bringing in a third party I found is really helpful. Sometimes they're need to hear it from another source. I would recommend two activities. I think activities can be an interesting way to explain it and maybe get a little bit more buy-in. There's an implicit bias association test. It's led by Harvard. It's really helpful because I think it brings everyone to the page that we all have bias, like no one's immune from it. So I think it's helpful because it shows what kind of bias, where you kind of lean. And also, there's something called a wheel of privilege. If you just Google it, I think it's a really interesting exercise because it overlays a bunch of dimensions from race, age, marriage status, and you outline where you sit. And the closer you are to the center, more position of power you are, and everyone lands somewhere different because we have all these different dimensions. But I think an interesting activity like that has been more helpful than maybe just explaining concepts to folks.
Yeah, that's great. And if you don't mind, Tori, if you can send those via email to me, I'm happy to include them in the follow-up email to all our attendees. And so I there was someone asking also about a lady at the shelter who was being trafficked and services. So if it's okay with you, I will share your email addresses also in the email, follow-up email, and then people can contact you directly. Um, and then the last question, we won't really be able to get a chance to really delve into this, what services are available for male survivors. Hopefully, we can talk about that a little bit more in our next webinar. Unfortunately, from my experience, there's not a lot of services for male survivors. It is a gap that we need to fill, and something that definitely needs to be explored as well. Because I know here in the state of Florida, there are no male survivor homes, and I imagine that's probably the case in many other states as well.
Yeah, I
So,
think you're correct with that. Surmise, yeah.
Yeah, I
yeah,
was
so
just
just
through our
go ahead.
housing safety directory, which I can post because I think someone asked about referrals and stuff, but I was looking through New York State. There isn't even a lot of dedicated housing options for New York State. It's a massive deficit. And I was looking to see because gender is a category and I can't find any for males at the moment, but I'll link it just in case.
Yes. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for joining us today. Thank you to our panelists, Tori and Jasmine, for all your insight and sharing your expertise with us on this issue. And we look forward to having all of our attendees join us for our next webinar in March. Have a blessed day, everyone.
You ought
Take
to.
care.
An hour goes by so fast. It was like
I
a blink
know
of
it
an
always
eye.
does.
Really
It
does.
always does. We always run out of time. But thank you so much. We appreciate your time.
Take care,
Have a
everyone.
great day.
They all